Alrighty then. Well, I was driving to Perth and I was just thinking of something. It's interesting that in modern society, again, this is just my thought on the issue, and some will disagree with me and some will agree, and some won't care less. They probably won't watch the video then. They'll see me talking and say, oh, this guy's talking again. I'll watch when Rocky's on. I will. Bring Rocky on and we'll watch him. I don't blame you. I like Rocky too. I'd much sooner watch Rocky than watch myself too. But anyway, what I'm thinking though is, getting back to what I was thinking, which, like I say, may be totally irrelevant, but I'm going to tell it anyway. What I'm thinking is, now, in this society, it seems that we've shifted into a mentality of we are under an obligation not to ever cause anybody any offense. We must not offend other people. We mustn't do that. That's the mentality that we shifted over to. And on the other end of it, people have a right not to be offended. So the mentality in modern society is each of us is obliged not to offend other people, and people are entitled to never be offended. Now, to my way of thinking, that's not a free society. A free society is the opposite of that. A free society would go like this. Each of us has a right to be offensive, and each person has a right to be offended. That would be a free society, you see. What we have right now is the opposite of freedom, this thing where you're obliged not to offend anybody. You're obliged not to offend anybody, and people have a right not to be offended. It should actually be, you have a right to be offensive, and people can be offended. Basically, that's what it should be. So if I say stuff that offends you, that's my right. And if you find it offensive, you have a right to find it offensive. So in other words, I have a right to offend you, and you have a right to be offended. The same goes the other way. You have a right to offend me, and I have a right to be offended, you see, as opposed to you have no right to offend me, and I have a right not to be offended. Which, like I say, when you get into that type of a thing, what you're getting into is you're getting into no freedom. That's what you're getting into then. You're getting into a totalitarian system. If you get into a situation where you're basically regulating what people can speak, regulating what people can say, what opinions people can express, and so on, because you've decided that society in general, or that certain groups within society have a right not to be offended. Plus, if you decide that certain groups in society have a right not to be offended, and you put their right not to be offended above the right of the majority, or of anybody, just Tom, Dick, Harry, or Mary Ann, to be offensive, then you're putting certain groups then above other groups. So, for example, if you say a certain race has a right not to be offended, and if you offend them, then you're violating their rights by being offensive. Well, then what you've done is you've put that race above other races. And actually, we had that back in the bad old days. If you go down into the United States, they had that back in the bad old days of the Jim Crow laws. If a black person offended a white person, the penalty for doing that was often death. Just look at that young fella from Chicago there that got murdered down in Money, Mississippi in 1955. There's a good example right there. He was only a kid, really, just a young teenager. And he caused some minor offense to a white woman who had a store, a general store. And, or so they say. I mean, that was the story. Whether it happened or not, I don't know. I think she's since come out and said that it wasn't what she said it was. That maybe he caused some small offense, but it was nowhere near to what she claimed it was. But anyway, the bottom line is, see, there was a situation where he did not have a right to offend her, and she had a right not to be offended under the law. And so, bad things happened. If it had been a situation where he had a right to offend her, and she had a right to be offended, then what would have happened is when he said whatever he did or whistled at her or whatever it was, there's been so many stories around that, we'll never really know. It's lost to history now. But whatever little thing he said that set her off, what would have happened is she would have said, "Young man, I find that offensive. And if you can't behave yourself, you can't come back into my store anymore." She would have said, "You're no longer welcome here. Leave." And he would have left the store, and that would have been the end of it. And now he'd be an old man, bouncing his grandbabies on his knee. That's where he'd be at now. If probably he'd have great-grandchildren by now because he was a teenager in 1955. So he'd actually have great-grandchildren by now. But, so like I say, it's always much better to live in a society where people have a right to be offensive and where people have a right to be offended, as opposed to living in a society where people don't have a right to be offensive and people have a right not to be offended. Anyway, that's it. That was just the thought that entered my mind, and I wanted to get it out before I forgot it, because I got a mind like a freaking sieve. When you drain the spaghetti and all the water goes out, well, that's about the way my mind is. I'll get an idea, and by the time I get around to committing it to some permanent medium, I will have forgotten all about it. Anyway, I'm nearly in Perth now. I got to get water, and I also want to get some of the good bread and some of the good raisin bread. And I want to have a look at what they have there for meals, too, at the Metro store, because they do make really good meals. In fact, I think their meals are even better than the meals at the independent grocer. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. It's kind of blustery here, but otherwise it's not so bad. I'm enjoying my new hat. I didn't think it fit proper at first, but it was just because it felt different on my head than the old hat. Seems to be okay. All right. Bye for now.